Good morning, seventh grade. As you can see, I am at home today. My daughter was contact traced and is quarantined right now. She's not sick. She's healthy as far as we know, but somebody at her school that she was nearby tested positive, and so I had to stay home with her today because she can't get out of the house. But hopefully everything's fine, and I'll be back. Uh, I'll be back next. I'll be back on Monday when you're back. So I will be brief today. We will try to get through these. Only a few minutes. We read this yesterday in class, but as um, Section 1 told us, we're heading for a breakup between what we now call the United States and England. And so today we're, pushing that envelope a little bit farther. And England saw the writing on the wall. They realized before any of the action really went down that um, America was becoming more unsettled, I guess you could say. Um, that there was a possibility that a rebellion was going to happen. And the quote, excuse me, from King George the Third in the book that we read yesterday was basically like, "Hey, we either got to figure this out or let him go all together, or the current course is not going to work." And so when you consider what we've talked about now for the better part of two chapters, how much money was to be made off the colonies and how much money was actually being made from the colonies, the decision, even though it might not have been the easiest decision or even necessarily the ethical decision for England in the long run, wasn't that difficult because it was a choice between making hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, or not. And when I say hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, I'm talking about even dollars in the late 1750s and early 1760s. When you adjust that to how much money that's worth today, it's a lot of money to try to turn your back on. British troops were called Redcoats became an insult, but it was really, like I said a few sections ago, they wore red coats, but they'd call them lobsters sometimes, bloody backs, and it was also supposed to be very cutting and insulting. You know what I mean? Like, um, hey, you're wearing a red coat, you're a lobster, and like, ooh, but whatever. But these people, it's really easy to just see them as a one big force that was violent and brutish and really um, pushing Bostonians around. And it's true in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, they were also people that were doing a job and not being paid very much for it. And they were literally having to take, people's jobs at gunpoint a lot of times to be able to pay for their stuff. And so, they weren't being really taken care of by England either, which does not excuse by any means the violent, rude actions they had towards citizens of the city. As you can see, it says there. Um, but, the idea that they were just in positions of power and pushing people around just for their own amusement is not necessarily true. They were doing a lot of things they did to try to get their own resources and their own money. And so, John Adams famously defended the troops at the Boston Massacre in court. He defended the Redcoats because there were a lot of accounts that they were having things thrown at them. Now, at some um, point, the reports are like oyster shells and stuff like that, which an oyster shell being thrown at you is an annoyance. It's not an excuse for opening fire on someone. You think of like I don't know if you know what oyster shells are, but they're really, they used them they ground them up and made like basically a pavement for the pads out of it. But you think of something like a peanut shell. You think about opening up a peanut, throwing the shell at somebody. It's not a nice thing to do, but it's not necessarily a violent attack either. But they were basically trying to, don't you dare, you wouldn't dare shoot us and all that stuff. And eventually, one of the Redcoats panicked and shots were fired. And once shots are fired, there's really no putting that toothpaste back in the tube. Once shots are fired, shots are going to be fired, and 5 people end up dead. And again, I'm not defending what the Redcoats did or didn't do. I'm just saying it's not the idea that this is the Boston Massacre that Paul Revere tried to make this into, as we're going to see here on the next slide. It wasn't necessarily because it was so brutal or, just bloodthirsty troops roving the streets, mowing people down in the streets. But that's what Revere tried to make it seem like. The reality is it's a more complicated situation than that. Although, like I said, that doesn't necessarily justify those people firing upon these, but it wasn't a situation where they were just hunting people down like dogs in the streets. They were, there was like a protest going on and things were being thrown and insults were being thrown. And, it was just an unfortunate situation. And so, five people were killed. Crispus Attucks, most famously, because he was an African American man. You don't have to write this slide down, but the reason they call it the Boston Massacre, since we're not in class for you to actually answer these questions, it's propaganda. They're trying to make people be on their side. They're trying to stir up emotion, stir up intensity, stir up feelings against Britain, and obviously it worked. I'm drinking coffee, not tea, right now, and so whose fault do you think it was? I mean, usually people argue in class about this, but what we end up with is like, nobody's and everybody's. It's not necessarily all of England's fault. It's not necessarily none of their fault. But you can't just go around goading people into shooting you and then act like you're blameless, especially if you're throwing things at them and stuff like that. But at the same time, when you're in a position of power, you're supposed to have more reluctance and more de-escalation techniques and stuff like that to calm things down instead of making it more intense. And so, like I said a minute ago, this is propaganda. Propaganda is, think about two kids at lunchtime get in a fight, and Mr. K brings them into his office. And that story, like what happened, those two people very rarely are going to tell the exact same story. I think we would all agree. They're telling, you know, well, yeah, we got in a fight because he insulted my mom, you know what I mean? And then like the other one will be like, well, yeah, he hit me with a brick, and so neither story is necessarily false and it's not necessarily true, but each of them are news stories that are given to try to influence the opinion of the listener. And that's what these drawings are done, these engravings that Paul Revere did, to basically convince Americans that British soldiers are mowing people down in the street, and all that good stuff. And again, the facts of the situation were already ugly enough without this. The idea that they opened fire and killed five people is enough to get people angry, even without the idea that they're just bloodthirsty, ruthless murderers or whatever. And then all the other stuff, the unfair taxes and the lack of representation, all that stuff is already enough to make people upset anyway, without the idea of having to push these narratives that they're hunting us down and killing us or whatever. But anyway, it worked. Obviously, people are more upset. And again, I know I'm not necessarily saying that Paul Revere and Sam Adams are bad people for doing what they did either. It's just a situation where people are upset, emotions are high, and it's not necessarily that they were doing this as a lie. It's they felt that way probably at this point. They felt like they were being put upon by the English and the Redcoats over and over and over, and they felt like any no matter how small, and loss of 5 lives, of course, is not small, but any sort of uh, um, incident that happens against them is just another in the long line of slaps in the face, and they have to feel like it's snowballing for them at this point. And so here you can see the drawing, of course, the idea that these are innocent, like, oh, poor us, and the reality is they were throwing things, and they all got these angry looks on their faces. He even threw in a dog in here, I don't, most accounts do not have a dog being there, but people do that all the time. They put in dogs because I talk about this in my class. Next year in eighth grade, we're talking about the Civil War. We're talking about the account on Fort Sumter, and we talk about how the attack on Fort Sumter, and we talk about how there were no humans killed. And people are like, yeah. And then I was like, but there is an old urban legend that a dog was killed. People are like, oh, and some of you are probably doing that right now, like, oh, those 5 people got killed. Yeah, that sucks. But like, then you're like, oh, and the dog may have been shot. People are like, oh, no, not the dog, which I don't have a dog, but I understand it. Some people are not very friendly. Dogs are usually all right. Now, Um, by the 1770s, any act passed dealing with just the colonists was basically considered by the colonists to be a conspiracy against liberty. They're not letting us have our freedom. The Tea Act actually lowered the taxes on tea, but just on one company, which again is unfair. The idea of free market and the idea of capitalism, which is what we're supposed to have in America, is that all businesses are supposed to compete on an even playing field with each other. And when you artificially lower the prices of one against the others, it really puts the other ones out of business. And that, of course, was the intent of what the British were doing. They were trying to save their own company. And so they were like, we're not unloading these ships. And for the most part, the British were like, fine, we'll take them back. But they were trying to prove a point in Boston. They're like, no, we are going to dock these, and we are going to see by military force that these are unloaded. And so, of course, famously, Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Mohawk Native Americans and threw 342 chests of tea into the ocean. I don't know what your scale for chest of tea is, but suffice it to say, this was a literally a boatload, but a lot of tea. Some I've seen some estimates that say in today's money, this would have been about over $2 million possibly worth of tea. I don't know if that's true, but think about what $2 million worth of tea looks like, or even even if you make up another number that's a lot lower, $200,000 worth of tea. It's a lot of tea either way. And so this really rallied the colonists. This was what's what I'm looking for, a symbolic. Obviously they dumped the tea, but also it was a symbolic gesture that, like, hey, we are not going to put up with your stuff anymore. And so the king is like installed a bunch of laws to punish the colonies, and they call them the Coercive Acts. To coerce means to try to get someone to do what you want. But the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. They closed the Boston Harbor, as they say there. Took away their rights to town halls, which became their important form of self-governance. Forced Bostonians to keep soldiers in their homes even if they didn't want to, which is weird, that you'd be like, hey, there's this dude named Gary that lives in our house now. And you wake up in the morning like, Gary, the soldier that you don't know, is on your toilet. And so, it's always become a running joke, because that's our Third Amendment, that, you can't be forced to house soldiers in your house. For most of American history, it wasn't even used, but, this is why it was there. And so we did not call the Coercive Acts the Coercive Acts. We called them in the Intolerable Acts, meaning it shouldn't and won't be tolerated. And so this is another of the rolling snowball down the hill towards the American Revolution. Attendance question today. Let's see. What is your favorite snack food? Potato chips? Do you like sweets? Whatever. Doesn't even have to be actually your favorite, just that you are watching the video, and you can answer the question. So that's the question you put in the Google form in Google Classroom today. For remote students, if you're in person and you do that, that's fine, but you don't have to. I will check your attendance by checking your notebook, of course, at the end of the 9 weeks, because a lot of you maybe don't have internet access, which is why you're in person to begin with. And you can't hear me saying this anyway, so I'm wasting my breath and your time. So anyway, stay safe, mask up if you go outside, wash your hands and all that good stuff, and have a great rest of the weekend. And I should see you on Monday. So have a good one later.